Okay, so the starter for this lesson, match the images with the terms below. All of these relate to our lesson and the theme of our lesson today. You could do this activity on a scrap bit of paper, a whiteboard, a book, whatever you fancy, or it could be a silent reflection. Choice is yours. Match the images with the terms below. So C was number 1, financial. A was number 2, physical. B was number 3, psychological. And that means D is number 4, environmental. But what on earth could all of these things actually link to? Risk assessments. This lesson is about risk assessments. So how do these terms actually link to risk assessments, do you think? Pause the video here, have a bit of silent reflection, and then come back. They all link to the term risk assessment because these are the effects that can occur if an injury happens. So that's what they are called, the effects of a hazard. And we're going to talk about hazards and risks later on, but this is not new information. This is something we've done before. But you may not have seen these effects of hazards before: financial, physical, psychological, environmental. So again, these are all the things that could happen to an individual if they are hurt due to a hazard on a working site or even in everyday life. So let's go through these one by one just to make sure that we have a really good understanding as to what they actually are. So a physical effect, this is an injury, a sickness, or an illness that has occurred to the human body. This includes short-term and long-term. So for example, it could be a small abrasion or a small cut, broken limb, or a permanent ailment due to physical injury. And when we say permanent ailment, we're talking about a significant life change such as maybe paralysis. Psychological. These are conditions that affect a person's mental health. So this could be something such as anxiety, shame, depression, or despair. Financial. This relates to the loss of earnings. This could be because someone has had to take time off work due to an injury or a sickness, having to pay fines for not meeting regulations, or paying compensation or having to pay to clean contaminated areas. And then environmental, this is anything that can harm the environment, such as pollution, air contamination, which includes dust and noise, and natural water contaminations, so lakes, rivers, and streams. But it can also include the discomfort to local towns due to noise, vibrations, and the feeling of confinement due to dust. So, for example, roadworks in a small town or a small village, dust can get everywhere. There are traffic queues constantly. Even some businesses will be affected as well. So those are the environmental effects of a hazard. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to add an example to the effects of hazards table on your worksheet, which is clearly listed under task 1. Why do I need to know these? It is really important that we always go back and reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, effects of hazards are important to be aware of for so many reasons. When using practical tools and hazardous materials, you need to be aware of the dangers as well as what could happen if one of these dangers actually happens. Task 2. Listen to the following scenarios and on your worksheet identify the hazard, the physical effect, the psychological effect, environmental effect, and the financial effect for each one. You don't need to write long lists or essays here. Just a short sentence or a brief bullet point list is absolutely fine. Scenario A. An apprentice carpenter has arrived on site to help install a new set of kitchen cabinets. They enter the kitchen and slip over a loose tile, banging their head on a portable workstation. The lead contractor calls for an ambulance who has to block the road when parking due to how small and narrow it is. This angers a neighbour who can't leave for an appointment. The apprentice has to take 10 days off work due to a concussion. Due to their contract, they are not paid for this time. Pause the video here, rewind and re-listen if you have to, but now I'd like you to give it a go of task 2 on your worksheet. Okay, so let's see who can I find the hazards and the effects from this text. So first of all, who can tell me what is the hazard? What caused harm within this scenario? Well done for anybody who chose a loose tile. That's absolutely spot on because this is what they slipped over. Next up, what was the physical effect caused by this hazard? Well done again to anybody who chose the term concussion. So this is a physical effect that actually affects the brain. It's where the brain takes a sudden shock or impact and it just causes confusion or dizziness, maybe even memory loss and also nausea. So there's not a psychological effect that's actually been listed here, but we're going to come back to that in a second. What is the financial effects of this hazard? Absolutely right. Again, for anybody who mentioned the fact that the apprentice wasn't actually paid for this time due to the contract that they were actually on. And finally, the environmental effect. So this is a trickier one. What do you think the environmental effect was from this text? An extra well done to anybody who spotted this one. It was that it angered a neighbour who couldn't leave for an appointment because the ambulance had to block a road. Very silly thing to be angry over, in my opinion, but it has affected the wider community. It has affected the environment somehow. So now I do have a bigger question. There is no psychological effect stated in the scenario. However, there's more likely going to be one or two. But what could one be? Have a minute, have a think, discuss it with the person next to you, either to your left or to your right. And if you can, add one or two suggestions onto the worksheets under the psychological effect column for this scenario. What do you think a psychological effect of this whole scenario might be? Okay, so hopefully you've had some time to think and to pair and share. Is there anybody willing to raise their hands and share their ideas or their responses? Okie dokie. So a couple ideas that I had for this one in regards to psychological effects. I think definitely stress and maybe some anxiety. The fact that they've had to take 10 days off work, that is a long time. They're going to be stressed about not being, not being paid. But also it's probably the stress of not being able to do much because I don't know who's had a concussion most recently, but when you are living with a concussion, you do just find everyday activities quite difficult because you're quite tired, you're groggy. Again, you might feel nauseous, you might feel sick, you've just got a headache. So it does make day-to-day life quite miserable. So I think there would be quite a lot that would harm someone psychologically. Scenario B. A bricklayer has been asked to work overtime to complete the outline for a new home on a housing estate. The sack truck used to move the bricks is broken. They asked the site manager for a new one. The site manager says there are none available, so they will have to carry them. As they are walking with the bricks, they stumble and drop them on their foot. They ring the site manager, who has to then shut down the site to take them to hospital. The bricklayer has broken their foot, reports the issue to the HSE, and then seeks legal support to sue the company for not providing suitable equipment. After months in court, they win the case and a settlement of £10,000. During this time, the site is closed and the company goes bankrupt, meaning the remaining employees lose their jobs and the neighbours are stuck with a view of a half-finished housing estate. Complete the table on your worksheet to identify the hazard, the physical effect, psychological effect, financial effect, and any environmental effects. Okay, so let's see what we can find. Who can identify what the hazard might be? So, what do we think the hazard might be from this scenario? I'm going to tell you if that's okay, 'cause it's not actually said, it's not really identified. However, they say that they stumble, but we don't know what they stumble over. It could be their own 2 feet, it could be a brick, it could be a tool, it could be a hole in the ground. We don't actually know, but the fact that they stumble suggests that they stumbled over something, and that might be a hazard in itself. So now let's go on to the physical. Who can suggest to me what is the physical effect from this scenario? Yep, absolutely right. They broke their foot, broken bone. That's a physical effect because it's harmed the body itself. I'm going to move straight over to financial. What was the financial effect from this scenario? There's a couple things here. You can kind of call it a positive. The bricklayer sues the company and they get compensation for £10,000. Now that is, you know, quite a reasonable sum of money. I know you're probably thinking that is so much, that can't be real. It actually can be, because you don't actually know what life-altering physical disability they may have occurred from this broken foot. Maybe it broke or really damaged a muscle or a ligament. Now they're walking with a limp. That's affecting their mobility. That might affect their way to work. So you just don't know how bad this broken foot really is. But £10,000 for some companies isn't actually that much money to hand over. However, for this one, it does then say that during this time the site is closed and the company goes bankrupt. So clearly that company didn't really have £10,000 to spare to hand over to just one person. And although a company creating a housing estate must have loads of money behind them, you know, lots of investors, etc. But if an accident happens, investors are most likely to, you know, pull out of the deal because maybe their trust is gone, and because of that, maybe they've lost some of their revenue, they've lost their income, they've lost that money to actually finish the job because they can't pay the bills for anybody else, etc. What about environmental? I'm going to go straight to environmental and then we'll finish off with the final one. So environmental, what's the environmental effect for this one? Yeah, it's kind of similar to the previous. Neighbours are stuck with a view of a half-finished housing estate, so it's similar to the other one because, again, it's about a neighbour. Having your view filled with just a load of bricks and scaffolding isn't the most enjoyable thing, and for some people who, you know, are really proud members of their community, to have that daily reminder of an incident that happened within their town, or just to see that unpleasantness and eventually it will just turn into a muddy swamp, can't be good for many people at all. So again, there are no psychological effects stated in the scenario, but I think there's at least 2 or 3. So why don't you have a think, a pair, and a share with the person next to you, and then come back to me and we can discuss what we think these ideas might be, what these psychological effects might be. So personally, I think the psychological effects here, I think there's going to be quite a few, and I think it's mostly going to be a lot of stress and anxiety for quite a few people. So obviously the company going bankrupt, that's the CEOs or the owners of this company, they've potentially lost a lot of money, but maybe their livelihood. So for them, that is a lot of stress due to the financial situation of it. What are they going to do now? Are they going to try and do another company? Is their reputation destroyed? Can they actually get new investors to create a new company? So, you know, that's a lot of food for thought. That's a lot of things to think about. And the other psychological effect that I identified here were for the employees, the remaining employees who actually lost their job due to the company going bankrupt, going bust. And also in between the time from when the site had to close for whatever reason till that final decision, you don't know how long that was. That could have been weeks or days. So they were probably living in quite a bit of uncertainty there. So again, a lot of stress due to the unknown. Okay, final one. It's a bit trickier, this one, so you might have to really think about a couple of things. Scenario C. A pedestrian is walking past a construction site. As they are walking past the front entrance on the public footpath, they slip on some frozen ice. They insist they are hurt, so demand for an ambulance. The ambulance arrives and paramedics check them over but don't have any medical concerns but agree to take them to hospital for a checkup. They have no injuries that the doctors can see. The pedestrian is adamant that this is the construction site's fault and demands they pay a settlement fee for distress. The owner of the construction site says no. The pedestrian calls the site office and the company's headquarters every day to complain and demand some form of compensation. Like I said, it's a trickier one. So have a little think. What is the hazard and what are the effects from this scenario? Okay, so I forgot to do a little animation here, but the hazard, for anybody who has identified it, is the frozen ice. So the frozen ice outside of the construction entrance, that is the hazard because that caused them to slip over. What about anything else? Are there, pause the video, have a quick class discussion. What other effects have you spotted from this scenario? Okay, so hopefully you've had a really good discussion. Personally, I could only think of one or two effects, and the effects that I thought of were psychological. There was no need for compensation. They weren't injured, and even if they were, it wasn't actually the construction site's fault. It's a public footpath. So if anything, they would have to go after the county council. However, they chose to go after the construction site. So they were ringing every single day, either the site office or the company's headquarters. And I'm guessing that probably caused just a lot of stress and just a lot of frustration and probably even a lot of anger for everybody involved, including the poor receptionist who probably had to pick up this phone every single day. I can't see any financial effects. There's no physical, in my opinion anyway, because obviously there was no actual injury from that the doctors could see. And in regards to environmental, I couldn't see where they had caused any disrupt. I mean, you could maybe think back to the ambulance, thinking back to our other scenarios. The ambulance may have been in the way. It doesn't state that here, but that is a little bit or a little food for thought to think about.